All right, so thank you overall, everyone, for coming for the last couple of sessions here. Name's Jeremy. I'm working at DocuSign. I'm part of a team that is focused on creating API standards within DocuSign so that we have a consistent experience for all of our APIs for our developer community. And that's something that we'll be highlighting today as we discuss what happens when your company grows, you need to scale APIs, and you want to apply API standards and governance. There have been a few talks on this today. My focus is really the technologies, the tools that can make your company more likely to succeed in this effort by making the whole experience really easier for any of your teams involved in these API standards. A little bit of context around myself. Currently working at DocuSign. I've basically been working on APIs for over 14 years. So I remember the days of XML and the lack of standards, and where really the bar was much lower for developers using APIs. Now, this made it generally more difficult to work with APIs, but especially difficult if you were building an app that connected multiple products through APIs. Through the magic of open APIs, of the Open API schema, we've seen higher quality APIs. But let's talk more about API governance and standards. OK, there we go. A little bit of the history with Open API, and there are plenty of other talks around this already. Most of us, I assume, at this point, have worked with Open API or related schemas. But basically, this has enabled us to generally create APIs that are more RESTful, but also through this sort of tooling, have many other features automatically done for us. It makes it much easier for us to create a solid developer experience. Documentation is auto-generated. Developer portals can be handled for us. And we've seen how there are even tools to let you just take your database, generate an Open API scheme off of it, and from there, create an API automatically off of your database. Now, I am a big advocate of utilizing these sort of tools to create your APIs more easily. But I'm also a big advocate of design-driven APIs, or what I also call product-driven APIs, which doesn't really encourage the auto-generation of your APIs from your database. But still, through tools built on top of the Open API schema, we can plan our APIs according to use cases. What really are our developers and our community trying to build? And how do we make it as easy as possible for them? Design your APIs first, and then through tools like Stoplights IDE or Kong's Insomnia, plan and design your APIs, implement your APIs, get your APIs launched. There are plenty of other talks around that, but I'm just emphasizing, let's assume we're utilizing these tools to design APIs well, and we've achieved product market fit. We have a successful developer community. Everyone loves our APIs. And then our business is growing, we're more successful, and we start building more APIs. And hey, maybe we've acquired a company or two that also have APIs, and well-designed APIs. Then we're going to run into this challenge, where even though we've created many, many good APIs, the various teams, some of which may have been through acquisitions, are designed very, very differently. And as we want developers to be able to work with all the various products that we have, despite well-designed APIs, well, it's getting harder and harder to use because even though they're all RESTful, they're designed according to use cases, they're really inconsistent. So this is where API standardization and API governance comes along. There were many other talks today about it, and again, I'm focused today really on the tooling behind it. Let's also talk about the scale of this. I've seen this challenge over many years. Well over 10 years ago, I worked with what's now Google Workspace, connecting with the Google Docs APIs, the Google Sheets APIs, the Google Slides APIs. And back then, it wasn't too long after, these are actually fairly new products to Google. They were also the consequence of 3 separate acquisitions. Rightly became Google Docs, iRoast became Google Spreadsheets. I forget where Google Slides came from. But when building one app to work with Google Docs, Google Sheets, and Google Slides, I could see how the APIs were different. They were well designed, but they were different. So Google had this challenge years ago and had to figure out how do we make sure that all of our APIs are designed consistently while allowing teams to have their own autonomy and building their APIs. This has been exacerbated really over the last few years. This chart is, a chart showing the NASDAQ, I think, from the last few years. And yes, it is outdated by about 9 months. Everything has returned recently. But, while our stocks came down, you know what hasn't come down? Demand for APIs. Yeah, so all of these companies during this time, they used to be unicorns with one team building their APIs. And as demand grew, they expanded to decacorns and suddenly had to have multiple teams working on APIs. So they all ran into this challenge at the same time of the need to not just have well-designed APIs, but consistent APIs. And how do you get there? We know from others you can't still have, at this point, you can't have one team just telling everyone what to do. But you need to have every team in agreement. And yeah, this is where we start to get into the need for standards established through a council. I'm going to get a little bit into the tactics there, but more importantly, the technologies behind it that make this easier to do. Fundamentally, this is about getting teams aligned on standards. That's easier said than done. And what's harder is getting teams to actually stick to these standards. On top of that, even if teams are going with your standards, you're still going to see some inconsistencies. Unless these teams are well coordinated and have a way of sharing on a regular basis what they're doing as they continue to build new APIs to ensure that as your APIs grow, they are consistent. So how do we do this tactically? First and foremost is having this API council. I think there have been other talks. I've actually given a talk at API Days that's 40 minutes long, so I've dived deeper into the strategies for the API council, but I'll just emphasize here, set up something egalitarian, where every team that is involved in external APIs has a say in this council that's responsible for establishing the standards. So then we can say, no taxation without representation. Everyone has a say in these standards that we're going to enforce and be terrible dictators about. No, but we are going to first have our discussions and then have a way of enforcing it. But I'm emphatic about, rather than calling it enforcement, we try to enforce this by making it easier on teams to build your APIs in general. Get teams to want to use these tools because it actually makes it easier for them. First and foremost, the most straightforward, and I'd say the most important tool is the linter. The idea here is, if you're designing your APIs in something like Stoplight, you'll automatically be informed if your API is not meeting REST standards, if there's something about that's violating the Open API schema. Well, you can extend it and take all those standards that were established. Say we require camel case for endpoints. We require snake case for our query parameters. Well, you can enforce that through a linter. And the lovely thing about a linter is how well it integrates with the pipelines today. I see it primarily fitting in 2 places. How much time do we have? Okay, good. In 2 places. Firstly, when you are designing an entirely new API, if you're using an IDE like Kong's Insomnia, like Stoplight, like Swagger Hub, when they tell you whether your API is violating an Open API requirement, it can also just automatically let you know if you're violating the other granular standards of your company. So you can catch an issue and make sure that your APIs are consistent before you even start building it. But then let's say you've also built your APIs and you're just adding to it. You're adding a new endpoint, you're adding some new properties. Well, the linter can also be part of the CI/CD pipeline then, and automatically let your developers know if these small updates have a violation. So you can catch these violations before they go live. I have seen this challenge at many companies when they're not able to catch these things soon enough. They have their standards, people want to go by their standards, they make a mistake, but you don't find out until the API is already live and in use by your developer community. By automating the process with your linters, you make it much, much, much easier on everybody. So there's linters, and there's also tooling to make your API model definitions reusable. Most good APIs today are RESTful. They are at least they're CRUD operations on top of models. A common challenge that I've seen is where the output of one API, say from Google Docs, can't be used as the input for another API. This is resolved by making sure that your underlying models, upon which most of our API endpoints are defined, are reusable across our teams. I know this is alleviated by teams when they're designing their APIs. If you use an IDE, hey, we can literally auto-suggest models that other teams have already been utilizing. It makes it much easier to plan your API if you're reusing models at your company. This is trick one. Trick two, the dictator trick, is to, as part of that CI/CD pipeline, check if any new models have been created. And if they have, assess it against a set of APIs that you've established to be part of your standard. Hey, if there's a new model, but it's very similar to something that's part of the standard, go back to that team and make sure they're not creating another model and letting your APIs get disjoint. Again, when the models are reused, all the API endpoints are much easier to work together. There are other tools when it comes to getting your documentation live, your SDKs live. And this is helpful to centralize. You're decentralizing API designs, but it's helpful to make sure your SDKs are consistent, your documentation is consistent. And so you have to have a system by which teams can get their API designs to you to generate those SDKs. A caveat there, one thing to really watch out for with these tools is even if the APIs are designed as RESTful according to the Open API schema and according to your own company's standards. Well, today there is a trend of auto-generating documentation, auto-generating SDKs, and these tools have their own rules and requirements. Maybe a team has really well used some polymorphism properties of Open API, but your SDK generator isn't ready to work with that, and it's going to error out. So this is something else to be prepared for. Have a requirement to go by REST standards in Open API. Have a requirement to go by your specific design standards around endpoint naming, property naming. But then also make sure that teams are aware of requirements and possible limitations of your documentation tools and of your SDK generators, so that teams don't run into any complications farther down the pipeline. So we have linters, we have the auto-suggest reusable API models that can go into your editors. And then we have, coming back to, one second, I jumped ahead here. And then we have those general extra requirements to note for if you're centralizing SDK generation and documentation generation. Let's also talk about the issue of rate limiting and other challenges when it comes to infrastructure across your various APIs. Even if your APIs are consistent in design, there could be some underlying challenges with inconsistencies if teams have built their APIs on different infrastructure. I've seen this more than once where companies try to have consistency in their rate limiting, but realistically, if rate limiting is enforced differently at different APIs, you can have some malicious developers who figure out how to take advantage of this. They find out that there's a rate limit to one set of APIs, and when they hit that rate limit, they can use another set of APIs because they may say they have the same rate limit, but they're enforcing it differently. So how do you handle this sort of a challenge? How do you make sure that rate limiting is handled consistently? This is really where API gateways start to help out, and I encourage consistency in your infrastructure, setting in your standards API design requirements that can be enforced by a linter, but then also setting your standards for an API gateway. This takes time. But what we do is we usually encourage teams to stick with their infrastructure, but when they're going from a V2 to V3 or V3 to V4 API, to plan out new infrastructure and provide them with tooling and guidance to get them on infrastructure that's going to be more helpful for them. But in the process, also give you this sort of consistency. So then you have one consistent API gateway. They can also work with distributed systems, microservice architecture, container-based architecture, but enforce rate limiting across all of your APIs to avoid this sort of malicious scenario. And then you have this other magical benefit of your API gateway, in that analytics and monitoring in general just becomes easier. Your data science team is going to love this. If they've seen as companies acquire other companies with APIs, what do they have to do? They have to write custom code for every one of these APIs to get the data, get the logs, handle monitoring, get all in a centralized system. This code is custom. It's error-prone. It's difficult to maintain as individual teams expand on their APIs. Well, If we get everyone onto their next API under consistent infrastructure, in particular a gateway that may have some API monitoring built in, logging, or through extensions, other monitoring and logging solutions, great. Much less effort, much less maintenance, much less risk of a lack of reliability. If you have everyone under the same gateway with the same means of analytics, this stuff starts to just work automatically. And this is where existing tools that we've been using already to design, plan, implement, and launch our APIs well, those API editors, API documentation tools, the API gateways. Well, when we look at what they're doing for the next generation of API companies as they grow and have to get to API standardization, how we can utilize these tools, linters, gateways, the doc generators, and our IDEs to making them more collaborative and establish this sort of a system that makes it much, much easier for everyone. In doing so, you don't just have consistency in your API. You're making the process for every one of your teams that has to create an API easier. The means of designing is easier. You're auto-suggesting APIs for them. The means of releasing APIs is easier. You're catching issues automatically for them and just happen to guide them to more consistent API. So these are the tools that we're already seeing today that I've seen build up over the last, I'd say, 3 or 4 years, after a good 4 or 5 years of tools around OpenAPI to just generally encourage APIs to be better designed. What's next, though? What can we do to improve upon this even more? I've been a big advocate of creative API decorators. What can you do to just generally make it easier to plan your API? This is one tool I just whipped up one day. When realizing that most of our APIs, even well-designed use case-based API, are CRUD endpoints under an underlying model, I figure, okay, let's design our APIs according to use case, let's go and define our model, and then we can auto-generate those endpoints. This helps me write 80% of my OpenAPI schemas. Axway, I think, is a tool like this as well, where you first define your model and it'll auto-generate the endpoints. There are other decorators I've seen at companies as they understand where teams are struggling, tools to take a loosely defined OpenAPI schema and try to make it strongly defined, add formatting, identify when a property should be an int instead of a string, and actually try to do that automatically to help your teams get their APIs in better shape faster. So what else can we do besides decorators? I'd like to take another look at the linter. These linters today are basically extending our validators for OpenAPI. And they're really all in YAML, JSON. Now for me, when I see a manifest that's based on YAML or JSON, it's always very easy to put a UI on top of it. We're seeing this with our API IDEs now, where you don't have to actually code your OpenAPI schema. You can actually just define it in an interface. And likewise, I've just started seeing this in the last few months. Companies that have created linters have also provided interfaces on top of their linters. So you don't have to actually programmatically code out your API standards in a linter. Once you've defined it with your API console, you can literally set the rule in an interface, have it generate your linter, and have it get distributed across your teams. So we're talking low-code, no-code, not just for API design, but for API standardization. And I do look forward to what we see over the next couple of years to make it easier and easier to make our APIs better designed, more consistent, by making it just easier for every team who's building an API to do so. All right, I think I got us still under 20 minutes, so thank you all for your time. Do we have time for any more questions?
I have 2 more minutes.
Oh, I have 2 more minutes, Doc? Okay, I thought I needed more time to just give it for Q&A.
Okay.
I can talk about, if you want, my longer talk did include some recommendations as to what to check for when you're actually defining your standards, which includes basically requirements for your endpoints, requirements for your parameters, requirements for those API models. But then also, besides the general, okay, how do your APIs look to developers, rules around API scopes and permissions. That I've seen is actually a very common oversight within API standards, that teams may seemingly have designed their APIs well, but it's checked to make sure they properly set scopes and permissions, which, as we've seen elsewhere in the conference today, is a bigger and bigger issue of API security. one key issue I've seen for API security is that we allow apps to just access all of your APIs. If you set rules around scopes and permissions, you can automatically check whether a new API has roles permissions really incorporated into the plan and give a warning that this should be established at the outset. So if anyone has any questions about topics like that, I can dive into more general guidance on what can be discussed in that API Council and how to make it a more egalitarian approach.
Any question on the API Council? Or at least the governance aspect? I have one on the exception process. You know, sometimes on the council, right, we set standards, but at the end, how are you sure the standards always are the exact fit? They're not too much in a top-down approach, but they are exact fit with what the people want. So I've seen something like using an exception process, like you say, look, these are the standards we thought are the best, but if you don't think so, you can apply to this exception, you know? And so like this, you get feedbacks from what really bother people. And so like this, what do you think about this practice?
Yeah, this is something I like to discuss. We want to dive a little more into the API Council process to make sure that it's egalitarian. When I establish standards through the council, besides the obvious propose something, make sure everyone's discussing it, it's important to A, mark certain items that are open items for further discussion. Like we may have established certain rules around, does everything have to be RESTful, or is it okay to have certain endpoints that are action endpoints? And what I usually say is, when in doubt, it should be RESTful. If you have an endpoint, if you've really consciously decided that an endpoint should be an action endpoint, it's going to be a better experience for your developers, it may be okay, but run it through the council first. So this is where teams have an option to, if they're violating a rule, they can go and reach out to the council or certain people in the council and say, can this be an exception, and have discussion around that. And what we literally do within the council is have our rules. Sometimes they're explicitly guidelines, not rules, where we say, hey, this must be this way, this should be this way. As in when in doubt, do it this way. But then also, here's a list of predefined exceptions. Like here are certain API verbs that we're generally okay with you using as action endpoints instead of just going by the CRUD operations.
Yeah. Any more questions? Are we good? Yeah, thank you, Jeremy. Thank you very much.